This recording was brought to you by King's Church Christchurch, New Zealand. www.kingschurch.co.nz.
I want to share some things very close to my heart, actually. The grace of God is one of those topics that grabbed me at some stage, particularly listening under Terry Virgo's ministry. It just got hold of me, and it's a great release to get hold of the grace of God. And I think I've already told us as a church that earlier, at the beginning of the year, you know, I retired as an elder, stood down, and I was struggling a bit, you know, just thinking, oh, where do I fit in? What do I do? You know, where am I going with this? You know, when you've been doing something for as long as I had, and you suddenly step down, you sort of get these feelings going on in your head. And right at the beginning of the year, and I'm praying, I'm reading the scriptures, and I read this verse in 1 Corinthians 15:10, and it's become the watchword for the year. I keep looking at it, I keep digesting it, taking it in, and it says this: by the grace of God, I am what I am. And that has been a powerful thing to me. By the grace of God, I am what I am. And I want to testify today that I am what I am. I am who I am by the grace of God. But it's by a work of God in me. You know, it's not just that suddenly I found some latent things in me and God did something to me. It's a grace of God that has created me, the person you know. Obviously my personality comes into who I am. God used the things that were there. The verse goes on and it says this: and his grace to me was not without effect. His grace to me was not without effect. And that's a marvelous thing. So I want to talk to you today about the grace of God as manifested in Christ. The grace of God as manifested in Christ. You see, I encountered Christ. I encountered Christ. And in that, there was the secret to my future life. So our text today is this: John chapter 1, verses 14 to 18. John chapter 1, verses 14 to 18. Words we know really well. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testifies concerning him. He cries out saying, this was he of whom I said, he who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me. And from the fullness of his grace, we have all received one blessing after another. So from the fullness of Jesus' grace, we have received one blessing after another. Verse 17. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but God, the one and only, who is at the Father's side, has made him known. Right? So that's our text for today. Now, in that text, there are two things: the law and truth. So what we read is that the law came through Moses, truth came through Jesus Christ. Now there's a big question there, because both of them come from God. And the question is, are they any different? Is there a difference between the law and the truth that is in Jesus? Both come from God. Law, according to this text, was given to Moses for the governance of how the people of Israel related to each other. In other words, it became the law of the land on which justice was based. So it was an external written law telling us how we were to live. It's like having, I often describe it as like a list, and you see the list and you check yourself against it. You check yourself, against that law. It's a Greek word called nomos, which became the means of being established by law, a decree of state. Do you get what I'm saying? It's like the law of our land. It's like the law of New Zealand, which if you break it, you can get hauled up for it. That sort of thing. There was another word called ethos, which was custom, and that was retained for unwritten law. Law then became rigid and a standard by which you were judged. That's what it became. It became the standard by which you were judged. So I knew a young man in London, a South African Christian, and I couldn't understand why he was so down all the time. He just was really down. And the reason he was down, because he was living under a burden of law. Because as he grew up in the church, in the Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa, every morning they would come like this, they would gather as a church, and someone would stand up and read the Ten Commandments. Right? They would do that, that's what they would do. He said he's had it every week of his life almost when he was in South Africa. In this church they would read the Ten Commandments. And it became like a great burden. Thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt. No matter how much truth was in it, that was the burden. So it became a rigid standard by which people lived. Law did not produce righteousness. Law did not produce right. It actually revealed the full extent of how bad we really are, of sin. It revealed it. So Paul says, what shall I say then? Is the law sin? This is Romans 7:30. He says, what should we say? Is the law sin? It's certainly not, he said. It's not sin. Indeed, I would not have known, and this is an interesting statement, I would not have known what sin was unless the law said, except through the law. So immediately you say it, immediately you put something out there, and I've often given the illustration, you see a sign, you go into some place, you see a sign on the grass, do not stand on the grass. What is the first thing you want to do? Walk on a grass cake. Quite right, it is. And there's something in us that stands up and says, do not walk on the grass. I tell you, I've been out of church time, but I usually go, I know, rebellious. But it just shows, that's what Paul's saying. He says, I would not have known what coveting was if the law had not said, do not covenant. But sin, seizing the opportunity afforded by the commandment, by the vision of it, produced in me every kind of covetous desire. For apart from law, sin is dead. So he concludes, he says, the law is holy, the commandment is holy, righteous and good. But that which is good then, did that which is good then become death to me? By no means. But in order that sin might be recognized as sin, it produced death in me. In other words, it revealed my sin. That is what the law of Moses, the external law, does. It reveals our sin. That was the law that came through Moses. Now what about the truth that came through Jesus? Is it any different? See, here's the question, is it any different? What is truth? Well, according to the New Testament dictionary, Thayer's study on New Testament word, it's what is true in any matter under consideration. Opposed to what is feigned, fictitious or false. He goes on, he says, in reference to religion, the word denotes what is true in all things pertaining to God and the duties of man. So is it any different? No, it's not. It's not any different. It can't be any different. It must be the same. I mean, Jesus actually said, I've come to uphold the law, not to disband it, not take it away. So it can't be any different. So what happens? Well, you know what happens when someone becomes convicted of their sin. You know, the old Salvation Army, General Booth used to have a penitent bench at the front, and you read the stories. You read the stories of some of those places in Bermondsey, where I was for 20 years. I just told you about those two churches. They used to have there, and they used to appeal, and people would come weeping. They'd come weeping to the front, so convicted of their sin when confronted by Jesus. They were absolutely distraught. And they'd come to the front. I remember reading about the Hebridean revival once, and I remember this man who was a drunkard and not a very nice man, because the power of the Spirit and revival was going on, he suddenly was convicted of his sin. He was in a dreadful state. He was weeping and wailing, and they called for, was it Campbell? They called for him and said, come, and he came. He said, I mean to go and help him. His wife blocked him and said, don't you dare. Let the old geezer suffer. Well, she'd had years of putting up with this guy and his horrible ways, and she said, let God deal with him. And God did deal with him, but he was absolutely distraught because he realised what he was truly like. It revealed what he was truly like. So if the two are the same, what is the difference? What is the difference? Well, the difference is the law, you see, was hard written, but Jesus says of Jesus, he was full of grace and truth. That makes the world a difference. It makes the world different. You see, this is a crucial thing for Christianity. It is central for all Christians and for Christianity. The answer to this question depends on whether we live in freedom or condemnation. It literally means that. If you're going to adhere to the law, then you will live under condemnation. You will live under it. If it's a written external law, you will live under condemnation. Just like my young friend, who we had to work and then set him free from this regime of the Ten Commandments drummed into his life, week after week after week, in order to get him set free. There are two choices then that confront us. There is our own efforts to be righteous before God, to be sinless. In other words, the law of Moses. That is a choice. We have a choice. We can choose that we live under the burden of the law. Or we can live on a declaration of the living God that sets us free from condemnation. We can choose to live under that. What is that declaration? Well, in the book of Acts, Luke quotes from the prophet Joel. And in Acts 2, 17 to 21, he talks about a great move of God. In the last days, God says, I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and your daughters will prophesy. Your young men will see visions. Your old men will dream dreams. This is an amazing picture. Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my spirit in those days and they will prophesy. And the passage ends in verse 21 of Acts chapter 17, Acts chapter 2 ends, and everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved from their sin. Saved from their sin. Saved from the consequences of that written law. Doesn't make the law bad or unrighteous or wrong, but it just saved from the condemnation that living under that law puts upon us. Saved from the consequences of our sin. You see, Jesus was full of grace and truth. Grace and truth. We are secure in him. You see, grace is the manifestation or the evidence of love. Grace is the manifestation or the evidence of love. Isaiah says, again, quoting him, of what grace is. He said, grace is that which affords joy, pleasure, delight, sweetness, charm, loveliness, grace of speech, goodwill, loving kindness, and favour. Now let's hit this. You see, the grace in Jesus looks at you and looks at you with joy. Yeah, looks at you with joy. Looks at you with pleasure. Delights in you. It has great sense of loveliness. Sees in you a great sense of loveliness. Yeah, what, me? What, me? Yes. Yes. That's what he does. See, that's the difference. It's not, how do you measure up? There's the Lord. Come on, how do you measure up? You can come to me if you measure up to this. No, no, no. Jesus says, call on me, and I'll save you from it. Because I love you, because I look at you with great joy, great pleasure. Yeah, it's true. It's true, Jeremy. Absolutely true. It's true. That's what God does. It is the unmerited favour from God towards you in Christ. This is the grace of God. This is the grace. Oh, there was a price to pay. Don't make any mistake. Your sin had to be paid for. The price had to be paid. But that was paid for by Jesus, which is why he was able to show such grace towards you when you called on his name. That was what it was. He was able to give you and afford you that grace because he had paid the price. Paul, once again quoting Paul, he said, this is Colossians 1:19-21. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. It talks about this, once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. But now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. Isn't that amazing? That is what God did. He does not hold up the law and say, how are you doing? He doesn't. He looks at us with such grace and with such love. This is grace. Total acceptance by God of you through Christ's death on the cross. No buts, no shadows, no hidden agendas, because God is love and Jesus came full of God's grace and truth. Grace and truth. And Paul again, when writing to the Ephesians in chapter 3, says, I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power together with all the saints to grasp how wide, how long, how high and how deep is the love of Christ, and to know this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. Isn't that amazing? You see, it's so wide, it's so high. We need revelation to get hold of it. We need revelation to know that actually we don't have to look at this law and check ourselves straight. Check. Oh, I failed at that one. No, as Ken was saying last week, that's what happens. And so you fail all the time. This is Christ full of grace and truth. And it affects us in that powerful way. When I first heard this preached, when I first started to look into these things, I was surrounded by people who said, oh, dangerous doctrine. You can't preach that. On Terry Virgo ended a message. He did a series of messages called Enjoying God's Grace. If I remember rightly, there were 4 parts to it, and the end of the third one, he said, God's love for you is so strong that were you to go out of here tonight, and you were to be standing at the crossing, waiting to cross the road, and there was an old lady standing there, and you barged her out of the way and walked across the crossing, it would make no difference to God's love for you. And then he closed the meeting. I mean, we're all sitting there going, you've got to be joking, And people were saying, oh, it's such a dangerous doctrine. So dangerous. I mean, people would just do what they like. People would go out and do what they like. With the love, I think, well, because it doesn't make any difference. There's no consequences. Go out. No. It doesn't work like that. You see, when we receive this grace and this truth in Jesus, something inside of us changes. Something inside of us changes. You see, that it's almost as though, and we could spend the whole message just talking about this, it's almost as though the law is taken from that banner and transferred into our very beings. And so it becomes a part of us. Suddenly we find ourselves wanting to walk with God. We find ourselves wanting to not do certain things. We don't want to walk that way anymore. There's a transformation that takes place in us. We partake, we receive the same grace and truth that Jesus had. It becomes a part of us. Therefore, we not only say no to that which is ungodly, we are so filled with God's love that we no longer want to live ungodly lives. Is that right? That's what happens to us. We don't want it anymore. And so Ken's message last week was on this text. For the grace of God that brings salvation has appeared to all men. It teaches us to say no to ungodliness and worldly passions, and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in this present age. So because you are filled with the grace and the truth of Jesus, when you walk out and stand next to that old lady on the crossing, you will not barge her out of the way. Because in you is the love, in you is the truth of Jesus. That's the transformation. That is what happens. Not only that, because we have received this love, this grace and this truth, we are equipped by grace to love and serve one another in the same manner that Jesus loved and served us. It becomes a part of us. It becomes filled with. This is what the Church of Jesus Christ should be like. This is what it should be. This is the way we should be as God's people. 1 Peter 4:10 says, each one of us should use whatever gift he has received to serve others. But the verse finishes, faithfully administering God's grace in all its various forms. So he says this, each one should use whatever gift you have received to serve others. Faithfully administering what? Our own efforts? No. Faithfully administering God's grace. God's grace in all of its various forms, in all the full scope of the love of Jesus. See, each one of us has been given grace as God apportioned it. The command of God is that we should love one another. We should have grace towards each other. Having grace towards each other is the outworking of that love. To come back to Thayer and his description of grace, you see, we should be taking great joy in one another. Great joy in one another. I look around and think, yeah, you're all looking at me a bit straight-faced, but I take great joy in that I'm part of this community. I take great joy in that. I take great joy. We should be looking at one another with great pleasure, thinking, wouldn't it be great to be part of God's people and God's way? Delight with great sweetness, with grace of speech, goodwill, loving kindness, and favour towards one another. You see, the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ, this grace and truth, lives in us and should be what we see to one another. What we should not see is judgment. What we should not see is people judging all the time. Oh, we have to deal with sin, we have to deal with things go wrong, but it should be with such grace, with such love. You know, that we're just doing things in a righteous and holy way. You see, we are a people of grace and truth because we inherit that from Jesus. We inherit that from Jesus. So to sum up, you cannot live by the law. As good as the law is, because all that will do is condemn you. You have to receive the grace and truth as in Jesus. That grace and truth will fill you. The more you grasp hold of it, the more it will fill you. You need to pray, asking God to fill you with these things. That's happened to me over the years. Particularly when I was a young Christian, I'd read things in the Word and I'd think, oh, I want that, Lord. I want that. Please give it to me. You know, the first time I read about wisdom, you know, when I read about what happened to Solomon, I read it as a very young Christian and I immediately began to pray. I said, Lord, fill me with wisdom. That's what I want. You know, I want that from you. Not me, not my wisdom, but I want it from you. I want you to give me an understanding heart. I want you to enable me to see things. And it's the same with grace. When I came across grace, I thought, oh, I want that. And I want to be amongst the church that is so full of grace and truth. I want both. I don't want grace without truth. You know? I think the Ten Commandments are amazing. You read them and it tells you how to live with one another. If you read them in the right way, they're just amazing truths about how we should be to one another. But they will still condemn you, just as a judgment. But when that comes in you, when that becomes a part of you, and it's mixed with grace, then it forms something different. We are a people of grace. So my heart to you is that go home and pray about it. Particularly if you have in your head, you're a bit of a judgmental person. You know, you're looking at things judgmentally on other people. Don't do it. Look for the love of God. Look for the grace of God. Yeah, it's dangerous, but it's exciting to walk with God in that way. The grace of God, amazing, amazing. Because the grace of God accepts me, or accepted me exactly as I was when I came to Him. I was acceptable. I often say, the thing is, God didn't want me to stay that way. So over the years, He's worked on me. But at each stage of my life, and that stage is true now, as that verse which God gave me at the beginning of this year that said that I am what I am by the grace of God, and his grace has not been without effect. Still true. God accepts me today as I am. Okay? Come on, let's stand together. Let's come before this amazing, wonderful God we've got. Let's just let our hearts reach out. You know, reach out your hands, reach out your minds.
This video recording is brought to you by King's Church, Christchurch, New Zealand. www.kingschurch.co.nz